and the Center for Culture and Development for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here for the first time in my life. I'm not a specialist in a sense because my engagement with the tribal questions in India is a known personal reflections and personal trajectory. I grew in a tea state and come from the working class background, so my interest was not really tribal studies, but basically question of labor and land. And my earlier work were actually dealing with agrarian social structure, the labor, and so on and so forth. It's only somewhere around mid-90s that I began to have an interest into the tribal questions in India. And as I said, I'm not a trained anthropologist who have been studying tribes for a long period of time. And this all happened by an accident rather than by choice, because since I myself belong to one of the tribal communities, my colleagues at Delhi School of Economics, whenever anything was happening on the tribal questions, they would ask me, "Oh, Virginius, what do you think about it?" And I would always say, "I don't know, that is not the area I'm interested in, I don't work and all that." He said, "You must know, why should you?" And this went on, and I felt very uncomfortable that I have not been actually engaged on issues which seems to be very important and on which you find that people think that I should. So that is when I began my reading on the tribal questions. And as I was reading, mostly anthropological literature, because anthropologists have been studying tribes for a very long period of time. And as I was reading, I found a great deal of uneasiness in the way tribal question was really being formulated and being written. And that was largely because I think I just put myself into that kind of situations. And I thought that, is it the way in which they have been writing and thinking? Is it the way in which tribals actually have been moving or have been formulating or have been located? And therefore, it is much of what I wrote is more of centering myself into those problems and try to reflect. And therefore, I said it's not part of very well-structured, systematic field work, etc. It is more of a sort of reflections on what has been written on the tribal questions. And as I said, therefore, I have not written any piece which actually deals with tribals in the context of a particular village or particular block or particular locality. That's what anthropologists have done. I think I felt that there is a need to draw the tribal questions into the larger agenda of India as a whole. And rather than localizing it, I think it was important that the tribal questions be taken away from being localized to the regional and the national scene. And that is what I think I have done, whatever works that I have done. And that's it, as I said, it is not really part of empirical, well worked out research. It is more of reflections on what has been written, and it is therefore more of a critique, and they try to provide a sort of an alternative kind of understanding. That's what I think I have done. Now, coming to this question of local self-governance, because it is a very narrow theme, therefore I will just try to confine on that. See, the earlier, if you really look at, people always thought in terms of administration, and even if you look at public administration. So it was thought that there is an administration and there are people who are manning these administrations, and they are the ones who are really supposed to implement or even or formulate the policy and implement the policy for the people. In that sense, you find it was really top down in the sense that there are people who have the agenda of formulating and then putting people into delivering that what's called whatever goods and services that required through this administrative procedure. Now that is what we talk about, I think, in administration. So it is basically government officials. But I think sometime around the late 1980s and early 90s, the whole terminology began to undergo change. From administration sweep to governance. And the governance, of course, it came from the new liberal traditions, particularly from the World Bank. But nevertheless, it has certain potential, certain kinds of frame of thinking about the governance, where you find that it is no longer someone who is administering you. But I think in the governance, I think there is a participation of the people. That there is rules and regulations through which this really, not arbitrary, but the rules and regulations through which, there should be a governance. There is supposed to be a transparency that people who are being governed actually they know what actually is really happening. There is also a process of accountability. So you find that there is also in the sense the efficiency. So what you will find that in governance when you talk about, at least an idea has come when there is a dimensions of accountability, there is dimensions of participation, there is dimensions of the rule of law or regulations. You find that there is a certain dimension of efficiency. So in that sense, you find it is a more democratic and therefore is more involvement of the people. So different stakeholders are supposed to be, let's say, participating in what is going to impact them or what actually is going to be delivered to them. So I think in that sense, the local self-governance, the idea has moved beyond the administration to the governance, where you find that even people who are really being governed are a part of it, and people who are delivering are accountable. There's a transparency. So I think these are an interesting ideas, which again, as I said, it really comes from the after what's called economic reform or a structural adjustment program, etc. So, but nevertheless, I think this. So now, when you talk local self-governance, I think there is, or people really think in a very different way. Even if you look at Ambedkar on the one hand and Gandhi on the other hand, they have two diametrically opposed view on the local self-governance. And if you really, because local self-government earlier was confined to the village, or let's say the cluster of villages. And I think in the case of the larger Indian society, which is marked by caste, surely the local self-government was not democratic. It was, let's say, if you really look at the Ambedkar's terminology, he talks about a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, and narrow-mindedness and communalism. So you find that the hierarchical caste structure, and within the hierarchical caste structure, the Dalits didn't have that kind of space to participate in the village panchayat. And therefore it was, Ambedkar was very strongly against this idea of the what's called local self-government, particularly village panchayat, as he says, this sink of localism, then ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism. And I think, but Gandhi, on the other hand, was really moving in a very different direction. But again, if you really look at tribals, you find that local self-government was something a part of their everyday life. And I don't think they really went through the kind of process of social exclusion and marginality and cruelty that Dalits has really gone through it, because they were really part of the larger Indian what's called caste structure within, and the village was primarily marked by a right number of caste structure in which they didn't really kind of replace. But tribals or Adivasis, by and large, if you look at, they were outside of the caste structure, and therefore you find that their local governance with panchayats, and they participated in it because that was, it was, I'm not saying the tribals were completely egalitarian, there was gender inequality, but nevertheless, there was no dominations and subjugations until the coming of the British, and therefore they can discuss the issues of the panchayat through deliberations, consensus, and really takes forward. So it has been an important part of their history, their important part of the traditional system of governance. When tribal areas were incorporated into the colonial political structure, there were problems. In fact, if you really look particularly Bengal, where you find many of the tribals, particularly in Chotanagpur area, because it was already part of the Mughal Empire, and therefore when what's called the grant of Diwani was moved away from the Mughals to the British East India Company, therefore it was the British East India Company that became very, very important. And therefore in all the territories that were under them, in order to raise the revenue and other things, they introduced new rules and regulations, and new rules and regulations were also in a sense imposed, let's say, on those villages or on those areas and territories where Adivasis were also inhabiting. And the moment this alien law and alien rules and regulations or administrative structure was imposed on them, series of revolts really took place, beginning with the Tilkamajis in 1787. In fact, Tilkamaji, there is a very important saying that I don't take tax from my people, so why should I pay tax to you? And therefore they realized that there is a series of revolts all through the late 18th century and the early 19th century. If you really look at 1807, 1809, then 1822. So all these revolts increasingly becoming bigger and bigger. And it is in that context you find that British thought that this system of administrations in the tribal areas should really be allowed to be continued rather than be tampered and rather than be imposed on the elite. But they were really very, very clever in the sense that they made the distinction between what is known as civil and the criminal administration. The civil administrations, they are allowed to be vested in the traditional system of governance. But the criminal administrations, only the minor crimes, minor offences, has to be taken care of by the traditional system of governance. But what they thought are the serious offences, but what they revolt against the British or dacoity and other kinds of things, then that has to be what is called taken over by the colonial state. So you can see that power, certain kinds of power was continued to remain in the traditional system of government, but more crucial power, particularly criminal administrative system, which was earlier being in a way in the traditional system of government, some aspects of that were actually being taken away by the colonial state, and it was vested in the colonial state. And that has a far-reaching implication, because anytime there is a revolt, there is in serious crimes, then it is not through the traditional system that to be administered, but it is to be administered. And therefore you find large number of people who were put into the jails, and I go through the very alien kind of law and rules and regulations. So I think that has been one of the trajectory of the tribals that's in the course of all colonial history, and it continues even today. So if you ask large number of people, they have no idea of what is the rules and regulations. But people think that you are born against the law of the country or law of the state, and therefore so this process really goes on. But nevertheless, what you find that the British realized the importance of the local self-government, and they accepted it, and it continued. It's not for the love of the people, but it was more of in terms of maintaining the law and order, maintaining the peace, because as I said, there's continuously rebellion and revolt that was really going on. So you find that, so subsequently also you find the British, they said that any law or regulations that is framed, let's say either what's called by the Governor General in Council or Governor in Council will not be applicable, let's say, in the tribal areas. That is how you find non-regulated tract, scheduled districts, backward trade tracts, and then eventually Government of India 1935 said excluded and partially excluded areas. Excluded areas became the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Partially excluded areas became the 5th schedule of the Indian Constitution. So this all, I think, that we find in the Indian Constitution, it has a history. And I've always been wondered as to why the fifth schedule, in the sense the excluded areas, partial excluded areas was put under the fifth schedule. Why not it was under the sixth schedule? Because if you look at the fifth schedule of the Indian constitutions, then you find, I'm bringing this because it is connected with the, what's called the provisions of Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act. Now, why is it that in certain parts of India, there was a sixth schedule of the Indian constitution? What is sixth schedule? It is a sort of autonomous district council. And what is autonomous district council? It gives you a legislative power, executive power, and judicial power over certain matters which are specified in the schedule. In a sense, it's a local. So what is the schedule? Land, forest, traditional system of governance, inheritance, successions. Now all these areas where you find the act of the parliament or state legislature is not applicable in the scheduled, six scheduled areas. So you have an autonomy. So all the areas, all those traditional and the background of the Scheduled Tribe and other traditional forest dwellers act. So it is not that this act, which is, I think, is a very radical act, which came out of the charity of the state, but it came out of the movement of the people, with tribals as well as larger civil society organizations, academicians and politicians, they were really involved in it. Similarly, you find that so that's one thing. So what you really find that in the fifth scheduled areas, you find that the governor was there, but governor didn't really do what he was supposed to do. And meanwhile, you find that